Welcome to AI-103 Practice Exam, Generative AI Apps, Models, and RAG. This focus set contains 25 original questions for generative AI applications, model APIs, evaluation, orchestration, and retrieval-augmented generation. Use each question to practice the design and implementation decisions you will need on exam day. Here's how this practice exam works. First, read the complete scenario and every response. Next, lock in your answer. You will have 3 silent seconds to commit, and you can pause the video whenever you need more thinking time. Then, I will reveal the correct response. Finally, I will explain why it works and reinforce the exam pattern. If this practice helps, like the video and subscribe to WebLizard's Cert Lab for the next AI-103 set. Question 1. An application calls an Azure OpenAI reasoning model by using the Responses API. The developer must cap the number of output tokens by using the parameter documented for that API surface. Which parameter should the developer configure? A. Max output tokens. B. Max tokens. C. Max completion tokens. D. Top P. Lock in your answer. Correct response, A. Max output tokens. Why this works. For reasoning models, the Responses API uses max output tokens. The comparable chat completions parameter is max completion tokens, while max tokens and top P are listed as unsupported for reasoning models in the archived guidance. Exam pattern. Configure an API-specific output token limit for a reasoning model request. Question 2. A Python application must connect to a current Microsoft Foundry project and then make a model call through an OpenAI-compatible client. The project uses the Foundry project's new API surface. Which configuration should the developer use? A. Create AI project client with the project scoped endpoint and default Azure credential. Then obtain the OpenAI-compatible client from it. B. Create an OpenAI client with only the resource-level endpoint and treat it as the Foundry project client. C. Hard-code a temporary bearer token as the project endpoint and omit Microsoft Intra authentication. D. Use Azure AI Project's 1.x with a classic hub endpoint and reuse the sample unchanged. Lock in your answer. Correct response, A. Create AI project client with the project scoped endpoint and default Azure credential. Then obtain the OpenAI compatible client from it. Why this works. The current 2.x Quick Start uses the project scoped endpoint with AI project client and default Azure credential, then derives an OpenAI compatible client for model calls. Azure AI Project's 1.x examples belong to Foundry Classic and are incompatible with this 2.x setup. Exam pattern. Configure endpoint scope, client generation, and authentication for a current Foundry project application. Question 3. During application evaluation, a model repeatedly invents customer attributes that were not provided but appear to be inferred from prior user interactions. The team wants the built-in evaluator that directly targets this failure. Which evaluator should the team select? A. Relevance. B. Indirect attack, XPIA. C. Ungrounded attributes. D. Fluency. Lock in your answer. Correct response, C. Ungrounded attributes. Why this works. Ungrounded attributes is the evaluator documented to detect fabricated or erroneous information inferred from user interactions. Exam pattern. Select a risk evaluator that matches a specific fabrication mode. Question 4. Contoso Claims is building a claims assistant in a Microsoft Foundry new project. The application must use project-specific agents and evaluations, retrieve authorized policy passages from Azure AI Search, and generate grounded answers. Public access is disabled on the search service. The team has a classic Azure AI Project's 1.x sample, but the production application will target the new project generation. Deterministic approval steps may be needed for claim-changing actions. For the connection workstream, match each implementation need to the required configuration decision. Requirements. 1. Allow an engineer to add the search resource as a project connection. 2. Call Foundry-specific agents and evaluations from application code. 3. Reach the search service after its public access is disabled. 4. Replace the incompatible classic project client code. Available targets. A. Use the Foundry project endpoint for the project scoped application path. B. Replace the project endpoint with only the resource-level Azure OpenAI endpoint. C. Use Azure AI Projects 2.x examples and packages for the Foundry new project. D. Grant a documented connection management role such as Foundry user, Foundry owner, Azure contributor, or higher. E. Configure private endpoint networking in addition to the logical project connection. Lock in your answer. Correct response. 1. Allow an engineer to add the search resource as a project connection. Matches grant a documented connection management role, such as Foundry user, Foundry owner, Azure contributor, or higher. 2. Call Foundry-specific agents and evaluations from application code. Matches use the Foundry project endpoint for the project scoped application path. 3. Reach the search service after its public access is disabled. Matches configure private endpoint networking in addition to the logical project connection. 4. Replace the incompatible classic project client code. Matches use Azure AI Projects 2.x examples and packages for the Foundry new project. Why this works. Connection management permission, endpoint scope, network reachability, and SDK generation are separate decisions. A project connection does not create private connectivity. Azure AI Projects 1.x is for Foundry Classic, and a resource-level OpenAI endpoint does not expose Foundry-specific agents or evaluations. Exam pattern. Separate RBAC, endpoint scope, private networking, and SDK generation decisions when connecting an application to a Foundry new project. Question 5. An agent is slow only when it calls a retrieval tool and then invokes a second model. The operations team needs to see the execution flow across LLM calls, tool invocations, agent decisions, and service dependencies to locate the bottleneck. Which observability capability should the team implement? A. Distributed tracing. B. A token usage alert. C. A scheduled red team scan. D. A fluency evaluation. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Distributed tracing. Why this works. Distributed tracing captures execution flow across model calls, tool invocations, agent decisions, and inter-service dependencies, making it the appropriate mechanism for bottleneck diagnosis. Exam pattern. Choose the observability mechanism for diagnosing a multi-component execution bottleneck. Question 6. Contoso Claims is building a claims assistant in a Microsoft Foundry new project. The application must use project-specific agents and evaluations, retrieve authorized policy passages from Azure AI Search, and generate grounded answers. Public access is disabled on the search service. The team has a classic Azure AI Projects 1.x sample, but the production application will target the new project generation. Deterministic approval steps may be needed for claim-changing actions. For the integration workstream, match each requirement to the most appropriate integration surface. Requirements. 1. Manage project-native agents and evaluations from application code. 2. Use embeddings with maximum OpenAI API compatibility and low latency access. 3. Implement custom hosted agent or multi-agent orchestration in code. 4. Combine connectors, deterministic conditions, and business approvals with agent steps. Available targets. A. Azure Logic Apps. B. OpenAI SDK through the resource-level endpoint. C. Foundry Visual Workflow Designer as an uncaveated long-term production dependency. D. Microsoft Agent Framework. E. Foundry SDK through the project endpoint. Lock in your answer. Correct response. 1. Manage project-native agents and evaluations from application code. Matches Foundry SDK through the project endpoint. 2. Use embeddings with maximum OpenAI API compatibility and low latency access. Matches OpenAI SDK through the resource-level endpoint. 3. Implement custom hosted agent or multi-agent orchestration in code. Matches Microsoft Agent Framework. 4. Combine connectors, deterministic conditions, and business approvals with agent steps. Matches Azure Logic Apps. Why this works. SDK and orchestration choices follow the required API surface. The Foundry SDK serves project-native features. The OpenAI SDK serves OpenAI-compatible and embedding workloads. Agent Framework serves code orchestration, and Logic Apps supplies deterministic connector and approval flow. The Visual Foundry Workflow Designer retires after December 1st, 2026. Exam pattern. Select SDK and orchestration surfaces by API and workflow requirements, rather than by a generic Foundry label. Question 7. Contoso Claims is building a claims assistant in a Microsoft Foundry new project. The application must use project-specific agents and evaluations, retrieve authorized policy passages from Azure AI Search, and generate grounded answers. Public access is disabled on the search service. The team has a classic Azure AI Projects 1.x sample, but the production application will target the new project generation. Deterministic approval steps may be needed for claim-changing actions. For the RAG workstream, which 3 design actions are required for a production implementation? Select exactly 3 answers. A. Treat a grounded answer as proof that the response is correct and safe to disclose. B. Send the complete private policy corpus directly to the model without a retrieval stage. C. Enforce authorization during retrieval and treat retrieved passages as untrusted input. D. Require vector-only retrieval because keyword, semantic, and hybrid modes are not valid RAG approaches. E. Prepare searchable policy content and an index that can retain citation and access control fields. F. Retrieve relevant passages and supply them as grounding data to the model generation request. Lock in your answer. Correct response, C. Enforce authorization during retrieval and treat retrieved passages as untrusted input. E. Prepare searchable policy content and an index that can retain citation and access control fields. F. Retrieve relevant passages and supply them as grounding data to the model generation request. Why this works. ARAG implementation prepares and indexes content, retrieves relevant material, augments the model request with that material, and applies retrieval time access control. Retrieval can be keyword, semantic, vector, or hybrid. Grounding can reduce inaccuracies, but does not guarantee correctness or authorization. Exam pattern. Design a complete RAG path that separates indexing, retrieval, augmentation, generation, and access control. Question 8. A team proposes the following orchestration configuration for a customer response workflow. Which behavior does this configuration implement? Visible artifact. The artifact is a response cycle. Component A drafts the customer response. Component B evaluates policy and completeness. Acceptance requires all required sections to be present and no prohibited actions. When a response is rejected, specific feedback is sent to Component A. The cycle allows a maximum of 3 iterations. When the iteration limit is reached, the work goes to Human Review A, a bounded maker-checker loop that revises from explicit feedback and escalates after the iteration cap. B. a parallel fan-out workflow in which both agents generate independent final responses without revision. C. An unbounded self-critique loop that stops when the maker informally decides the response is good enough. D. A hidden reasoning extractor that reads reasoning tokens as the checker transcript. Lock in your answer. Correct response, A. A bounded maker-checker loop that revises from explicit feedback and escalates after the iteration cap. Why this works. The maker produces a response. The checker evaluates it against defined criteria, and specific feedback drives revision. The loop stops on approval or after 3 iterations when it falls back to human review. Exam pattern. Interpret configuration controls to determine whether a reflection loop is bounded, criteria-driven, and recoverable. Question 9. A Python application targets a Foundry new project. It must list project connections and enable tracing, then call a deployed model through the project endpoint. The team wants to avoid mixing Foundry classic examples with the new project. Which client composition should it implement? A. Install Azure AI projects at least 2.0.0. Construct AI project client with the project endpoint and default Azure credential. Use that client for project native operations and obtain its OpenAI compatible client for model calls. B. Install Azure AI projects equals 1.0.0. Point its classic project client at the new project endpoint. Use a standalone OpenAI client to list connections, and use the project client only for model responses. C. Use a Foundry Tool Service SDK as the project client. Derive AI project client from the tool endpoint, and send project configuration through the tool-specific client before making model calls. D. Use only the OpenAI SDK at the OpenAI version 1 endpoint for connection listing, tracing configuration, project properties, and model calls, because all Foundry project APIs share the OpenAI shape. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Install Azure AI projects at least 2.0.0. Construct AI project client with the project endpoint and default Azure credential. Use that client for project native operations and obtain its OpenAI compatible client for model calls. Why this works. Foundry SDK 2.x targets Foundry New. 1.x targets Foundry Classic. AI Project Client uses the project endpoint and default Azure credential for project native operations such as connections, properties, and tracing. Its OpenAI compatible client handles OpenAI shaped model, agent, and evaluation operations on the project endpoint. Exam pattern. Choose the compatible SDK generation and client boundary for a mixed project native and OpenAI compatible Python integration. Question 10. A team is designing a new, long-lived production solution in which hosted agents hand-work to one another according to runtime context. The orchestration must run from code and expose a Foundry-managed endpoint. Which design should the team choose? A. Use only the resource-level OpenAI endpoint because it exposes all Foundry agent and platform tool features. B. Use a sequential visual workflow, so control always passes in a fixed order, regardless of runtime context. C. Build the orchestration with Agent Framework and deploy the code as a hosted agent. D. Insert the hosted agents directly into the Foundry Visual Workflow Designer for the permanent production design. Lock in your answer. Correct response. C. Build the orchestration with Agent Framework and deploy the code as a hosted agent. Why this works. Agent Framework is the recommended code orchestration layer for hosted and multi-agent systems. Hosted agents are not supported in the Visual Workflow Designer, and that visual feature is public preview and scheduled to retire on December 1st, 2026. Exam pattern. Choose an orchestration architecture for new hosted agents with context-driven handoffs and production longevity. Question 11. A Microsoft Foundry RAG application returns polished answers that address each user's topic. Evaluation samples show that some answer details are not supported by the passages retrieved for that request. The team must measure this specific failure against the retrieved context. Which evaluator should the team use? A. Groundedness. B. Relevance. C. Retrieval. D. Fluency. Lock in your answer. Correct response, A. Groundedness. Why this works? Use groundedness because the decision is whether the response is supported by the retrieved context. Relevance measures fit to the query. Fluency measures language quality and readability, and retrieval measures how effectively the system retrieves relevant information. Exam pattern. Select the evaluator that diagnoses unsupported generated details when query fit and readability are not the failing dimensions. Question 12. A team is building a custom RAG application for a Microsoft Foundry project new by using Azure AI Projects 2.x. The application already creates the project client with default Azure credential and obtains an OpenAI-compatible client. The current generation code is shown. It does not query the Team S index. Which correction completes the RAG mechanism while preserving the current 2.x generation path? Visible artifact. The code calls the OpenAI Responses application programming interface. It uses the Generative Pre-trained Transformer 5 mini-model. It sends the user question as input. It stores the returned response and prints the response output text A. Keep the request unchanged and fine-tune the model so that an index query is no longer required. B. Query the index for relevant passages. Combine those passages with user question and pass the augmented prompt as input. C. Replace the 2.x project client with Azure AI Projects 1.x while keeping input equal to user question. D. Add a citation format instruction to user question and send it without retrieving passages from a data store. Lock in your answer. Correct response, B. Query the index for relevant passages, combine those passages with user question, and pass the augmented prompt as input. Why this works? Our RAG application must retrieve relevant content, augment the user's input with that grounding data, and then generate a response from the augmented prompt. The shown responses API call supplies the generation stage only. Azure AI Projects 2.x code must not be mixed with 1.x code. Exam pattern. Correct a model-only Foundry Responses API call by adding the missing retrieval and augmentation stages without crossing SDK generations. Question 13. A team is documenting an existing Microsoft Foundry visual workflow before migration. This visual workflow surface is public preview without a service level agreement, is not recommended for production workloads, and is scheduled to retire on December 1st, 2026. In the existing definition, the output of an intake agent must be passed to a specialist agent in a defined order. Before the process can continue, a manager must review the specialist's result and provide approval. Which two workflow patterns directly provide the required behaviors? Select two answers. A. Per request model routing. B. Human in the loop. C. Sequential. D. Group chat. E. Single model generation. Lock in your answer. Correct response, B. Human in the loop. C. Sequential. Why this works? Sequential orchestration passes results from one agent to the next in a defined order. Human in the loop asks for user input and waits, which supports the required approval pause. Exam pattern. Compose two documented workflow patterns to meet fixed stage ordering and an explicit approval gate. You are halfway through the practice exam. Reset your attention. Keep model call, orchestration, evaluation, and retrieval boundaries clear, and verify the exact mechanism each requirement needs. Question 14. A company is creating a new visual, low-code business process. It must combine a deterministic eligibility condition with a Foundry agent's probabilistic recommendation, require human approval, and perform a downstream connector action only after approval. The company chooses Azure Logic Apps rather than the Foundry Visual Workflow Designer, which is public preview without a service-level agreement, is not recommended for production workloads, and is scheduled to retire on December 1st, 2026. Arrange the process steps in the required order. Arrange all 4 steps in the correct order. A. Send the agent's recommendation for human approval. B. Evaluate the deterministic eligibility condition. C. Call the Foundry agent on the branch that requires AI reasoning. D. Invoke the approved downstream connector action. Lock in your answer. Correct response. Step 1. Evaluate the deterministic eligibility condition. Step 2. Call the Foundry agent on the branch that requires AI reasoning. Step 3. Send the agent's recommendation for human approval. Step 4. Invoke the approved downstream connector action. Why this works. The deterministic condition selects the branch before AI reasoning is invoked. The generated recommendation then enters the required approval gate, and the downstream connector action occurs only after approval. Azure Logic Apps is the documented visual low-code migration path for combining deterministic steps and approvals with probabilistic Foundry agents. Exam pattern. Order a supported visual hybrid process so deterministic branching, probabilistic reasoning, approval, and downstream action occur at the intended boundaries. Question 15. Under the archived guidance, a team plans a custom Microsoft Foundry model router deployment using active version 2025-11-18. Requests can be large, prompts must remain within an approved data zone model pool, and transient failure of one approved model must not stop routing. Which 3 actions should the team take? Select 3 answers. A. Create a model subset with at least 2 approved models that all satisfy the required context size. B. Use a supported region and data zone standard deployment type and verify the applicable Tier S, RPM, and TPM. C. Size requests against the largest underlying model because the router automatically skips smaller context windows. D. Assume the date-stamped active version has an immutable underlying model set and omit subset regression checks. E. Allow failover to use any catalog model, including models outside the approved subset. F. Verify that the subset models are eligible for the team's access and deployment type, and honor the required data zone boundary. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Create a model subset with at least 2 approved models that all satisfy the required context size. B. Use a supported region and data zone standard deployment type and verify the applicable Tier S, RPM, and TPM. F. Verify that these subset models are eligible for the team's access and deployment type and honor the required data zone boundary. Why this works. A custom subset constrains normal routing and failover to approved models. At least 2 models are needed to benefit from fallback. Every selected model must satisfy the required context because the smallest underlying context window limits the request. Access, deployment type, data zone, supported region, and tier-specific quota constraints remain material. Version 2025-11-18 is active and updated in place, so its model set is not inherently immutable. Exam pattern. Govern a custom model router deployment across approved pool failover, context compatibility, data zone eligibility, regional availability, and quota. Question 16. A Microsoft Foundry evaluation run must score task completion across an entire multi-turn support conversation. The run is configured with evaluation level set to conversation, but one selected evaluator supports only turn-level evaluation. Which change makes the run valid while preserving the conversation-wide objective? A. Keep both evaluators in the same run, because the configured level overrides their supported levels. B. Omit evaluation level, so the run defaults to turn while keeping the conversation-wide objective. C. Collect distributed traces and treat the trace bands as conversation-level evaluator scores. D. Replace the turn-only evaluator with an evaluator that supports the conversation level. Lock in your answer. Correct response, D. Replace the turn-only evaluator with an evaluator that supports the conversation level. Why this works. All evaluators in a run must support the configured evaluation level. Replacing the incompatible evaluator preserves conversation level scoring. Omitting evaluation level would default the run to turn level and would not preserve the stated objective. Exam pattern. Repair an invalid evaluator set without changing the required conversation-wide measurement grain. Question 17. A team is building a code-based multi-agent system that will run as a Microsoft Foundry hosted agent. The system requires project-scoped data on behalf of tool authentication, Foundry platform tools, and the project as tracing, content filters, and identity configuration. Which implementation should the team choose? A. Use the resource-level OpenAI endpoint because it exposes all Foundry agents, evaluations, and platform tools. B. Use Microsoft Agent Framework and call the Responses API through the Foundry project endpoint. C. Use only a resource-level embeddings request and treat the embedding endpoint as the orchestration runtime. D. Insert the hosted agent directly into the Foundry Visual Workflow Designer and use designer nodes for orchestration. Lock in your answer. Correct response. B. Use Microsoft Agent Framework and call the Responses API through the Foundry project endpoint. Why this works. Microsoft Agent Framework is the recommended code orchestration layer for hosted agents. Through the Foundry project endpoint, it can use the Responses API with project-scoped data, OBO tool authentication, platform tools, tracing, content filters, and identity configuration. The resource-level OpenAI endpoint does not expose Foundry-specific agents, evaluations, or exclusive platform tools, and hosted agents are not supported in the Visual Workflow Designer. Exam pattern. Choose the code orchestration layer and API endpoint that preserve project-scoped Foundry capabilities for a hosted agent. Question 18. An engineer reviews 4 events from a Microsoft Foundry RAG request. Match each event to the mechanism it implements. Requirements. 1. The application queries an index for passages relevant to the user's question. 2. The application combines the question and returned passages into one prompt. 3. The model receives the combined prompt and produces a response. 4. The Azure AI Search data source applies document-level security filters to restrict which index documents the caller can retrieve. Available targets. A. Generate. B. Augment. C. Retrieval time authorization. D. Retrieve. Lock in your answer. Correct response. 1. The application queries an index for passages relevant to the user's question. Matches retrieve. 2. The application combines the question and returned passages into one prompt. Matches augment. 3. The model receives the combined prompt and produces a response. Matches generate. 4. The Azure AI Search data source applies document-level security filters to restrict which index documents the caller can retrieve. Matches retrieval time authorization. Why this works. RAG separates retrieval, prompt augmentation, and generation. Authorization is a separate control applied when content is retrieved. Grounding alone does not decide which documents a caller may access. Exam pattern. Classify observed application events into RAG processing stages, while keeping retrieval authorization as a separate mechanism. Question 19. In a non-production evaluation, a team is correcting the observability setup plan shown for a Microsoft Foundry agent. The Foundry new portal metric view is public preview without a service level agreement and is not recommended for production workloads. The team must debug execution flow across LLM calls, tool invocations, and dependencies. Inspect token usage and latency, and configure sampled safety evaluation. Which replacement order correctly separates the required capabilities and satisfies the dashboard prerequisite? Visible artifact. The current observability order is to open the agent monitoring dashboard, then configure continuous evaluation, then connect application insights, then enable distributed tracing. A. Connect application insights and grant required access. Enable distributed tracing. Configure safety evaluators and a sample rate. Inspect token and latency metrics. B. Open the dashboard first. Infer complete tool call traces from token charts. Then connect application insights only if charts are empty. C. Enable tracing first. Treat trace spans as safety scores. Then use latency as the single measure of response quality. D. Configure sampled evaluation first. Treat evaluator scores as dependency traces, then omit the application insights connection. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Connect application insights and grant required access. Enable distributed tracing. Configure safety evaluators and a sample rate. Inspect token and latency metrics. Why this works. The agent monitoring dashboard reads telemetry from an application insights resource connected to the Foundry project and requires appropriate access. Distributed tracing provides execution flow visibility. Continuous evaluation must be configured with evaluators and a sample rate for sampled outputs, while token usage and latency remain distinct monitoring metrics. Exam pattern. Correct an observability implementation sequence while assigning tracing, sampled evaluation, and operational metrics to distinct roles. Question 20. A team is implementing a new, long-lived multi-agent process with Microsoft Agent Framework rather than the Foundry Visual Workflow Designer, which is public preview without a service-level agreement, is not recommended for production workloads, and is scheduled to retire on December 1st, 2026. An intake agent must produce a case summary. A specialist agent must use that summary to draft a resolution. A human must approve the draft, and only then may a finalization agent complete the case. Arrange the orchestration steps. Arrange all 5 steps in the correct order. A. Have the specialist agent produce the draft resolution. B. Run the finalization agent after approval is received. C. Pass the intake summary to the specialist agent. D. Pause the workflow and request human approval of the draft. E. Run the intake agent to create the case summary. Lock in your answer. Correct response, Step 1. Run the intake agent to create the case summary. Step 2. Pass the intake summary to the specialist agent. Step 3. Have the specialist agent produce the draft resolution. Step 4. Pause the workflow and request human approval of the draft. Step 5. Run the finalization agent after approval is received. Why this works. Sequential orchestration passes one agent's result to the next in a defined order. The human-in-the-loop gate waits for approval after the draft exists, and finalization occurs only after approval. Microsoft Agent Framework is the documented recommended code orchestration layer for new hosted agent and multi-agent workflows. Exam pattern. Order a code-first workflow that combines a fixed 2-agent handoff with a human approval gate and post-approval continuation. Question 21. A support application must answer each employee question by using only passages relevant to that question from a maintained knowledge index. The team wants an application-level RAG design rather than a model-only prompt. A. Attach the complete knowledge collection to every model request and omit retrieval so that the model can choose relevant passages by itself. B. Fine-tune the model on the indexed documents. Send only the employee question at runtime and rely on the tuned weights for grounding. C. Query the index for relevant content. Combine the question with the retrieved grounding data, and send the augmented prompt to the model. D. Send the employee question to the model first, then search the index only after generation to confirm whether the response seems plausible. Lock in your answer. Correct response, C. Query the index for relevant content. Combine the question with the retrieved grounding data and send the augmented prompt to the model. Why this works? An application RAG request has 3 distinct stages: retrieve relevant content, augment the user's input with that grounding data, and generate from the augmented prompt. A model call or document exposure without request time retrieval does not implement that flow. Exam pattern. Choose the application request flow that actually implements RAG. Question 22. A developer is configuring a Python application for a Foundry new project by using Azure AI Projects 2.x. The application will make project-scoped model calls through the client obtained from the project client. Which 3 actions should the developer take? Select 3 answers. A. Store the project-scoped endpoint, including the resource and project names, in the application environment. B. Construct AI Project Client with the project endpoint and default Azure credential, then obtain the OpenAI-compatible client from it. C. Replace the project endpoint with the resource-level OpenAI endpoint because both endpoint scopes expose every Foundry project feature. D. Run AZ login before the local Python script so the documented identity flow can authenticate. E. Treat creation of project connection metadata as sufficient private connectivity, even when the connected resource disables public access. F. Use an Azure AI Projects 1.x Foundry Classic example unchanged with the 2.x application because the client generations are compatible. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Store the project-scoped endpoint, including the resource and project names, in the application environment. B. Construct a AI Project Client with the project endpoint and default Azure credential, then obtain the OpenAI-compatible client from it. D. Run AZ login before the local Python script so the documented identity flow can authenticate. Why this works? For the documented Foundry new Python flow, store the project endpoint, authenticate with AZ login for the local script, and construct AI Project Client with default Azure credential before deriving the OpenAI-compatible client. Project and resource endpoint scopes are not interchangeable. 2.x code is incompatible with 1.x, and logical connection metadata does not supply private network connectivity. Exam pattern. Select the complete application configuration baseline for a Foundry new Python project. Question 23. An application uses the Responses API with AGPT 5.6 reasoning model deployment. For a difficult evaluation workload, the team wants the highest reasoning effort level documented for this exact model and API, plus an API-appropriate output token cap. A. Set reasoning effort to minimal and set max output tokens to the required output cap. B. Set temperature to 0.2 and set max output tokens to the required output cap. C. Set reasoning effort to max and set max completion tokens to the required output cap. D. Set reasoning effort to max and set max output tokens to the required output cap. Lock in your answer. Correct response. D. Set reasoning effort to max and set max output tokens to the required output cap. Why this works? For GPT 5.6, max reasoning effort is documented only with the Responses API. The Responses API uses max output tokens. Max completion tokens belongs to chat completions, Minimal is not supported with GPT 5.1 or later, and reasoning models list temperature as unsupported. Exam pattern. Configure model and API-specific reasoning depth and output limits. Question 24. An application is being simplified to one client. Its indexing worker creates embeddings, while its interactive path calls Foundry models through chat completions. Benchmarking has made request latency the deciding factor. Which client and base URL should replace the two existing configurations? A. Use the OpenAI SDK with https://less than resource name greater than .openai.azure.com OpenAI version 1 for both operations. B. Use the Foundry SDK with https://less than resource name greater than .services.ai.azure.com/API/projects/less than project name greater than for both operations. C. Use Agent Framework through Foundry Chat Client at the project endpoint for both operations. D. Use the Anthropic SDK with https://less than resource name greater than .services.ai.azure.com/Anthropic for both operations. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Use the OpenAI SDK with https://less than resource-name greater than .openai.azure.com OpenAI version 1 for both operations. Why this works. The OpenAI SDK covers embeddings and Foundry models through chat completions, and Microsoft identifies it as the lowest latency OpenAI compatible path. Its documented base URL is the resource OpenAI version 1 endpoint. The project endpoint serves Foundry project APIs. Agent Framework serves orchestration, and the Anthropic endpoint serves Claude models. Exam pattern. Select a client and endpoint from workload operations and latency, not lexical name matching. Question 25. A production RAG assistant uses Azure AI Search. Tests show that citations are present, but an employee can retrieve a passage from a document they are not permitted to read. Some index documents can also contain instructions intended to redirect the model. A. Apply document-level security filters at retrieval time. Prefer Microsoft Entra ID over API keys, and treat retrieve passages as untrusted input in system and application logic. B. Switch the index to vector-only retrieval, because vector similarity prevents unauthorized documents and malicious instructions from being returned. C. Keep the current retrieval permissions, require citations in every answer, and treat a cited passage as authorized and safe to follow. D. Fine-tune the model on the documents, remove retrieval time filtering, and rely on the trained model to decide which employee may see. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Apply document-level security filters at retrieval time. Prefer Microsoft Entra ID over API keys, and treat retrieved passages as untrusted input in system and application logic. Why this works. Grounding and authorization are independent. The production design should enforce access when retrieving documents. Prefer Microsoft Entra ID over production API keys, and treat retrieved passages as untrusted input to reduce prompt injection risk. Citations. Retrieval mode or model behavior do not create access control. Exam pattern. Remediate a grounded RAG system that fails disclosure authorization and document prompt injection controls. You completed AI-103 practice exam, Generative AI Apps, Models, and RAG. Review the mechanisms you missed, revisit the official documentation where needed, and use the next set to strengthen your exam-ready judgment. Thank you for practicing with WebLizard CertLab. Continue with AI-103 practice exam, agents, tools, and multi-agent solutions.